Transmitter device activated. Coordinates set for Earth 2.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Earth 2 podcast, your weekly exploration of the DC Comics multiverse and the legacy of their Golden Age characters through the Silver and the Bronze Ages of comics. I'm Peter Watson.
I'm Mark Russell.
And I'm David Steele. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us. This week we're doing a story from issue 10 of Supergirl, published on the 27th of June, 1974, 9 days after Paul McCartney's 32nd birthday, and literally only 2 days after Adventure Comics 435 and I think Flash 229 as well, so that's weird. Why are we doing issue 10 of Supergirl? Is it a point of view of political history? Is that where we're coming from this week? Anyway,
Could be.
to give you some more of an idea, over to President Watson to tell you about the cover.
The cover has the DC Comics bullet in the top left-hand corner, the line of DC superstars. Supergirl is the big logo at the side, with Supergirl standing right by the S. 20 cents, number 10, approved by the Comics Code Authority. Now, listeners, this is very interesting. In the original issue, the date given on the 20 cents button says October. But in the reprint that I'm reading from the Prez, the first Teenage President graphic novel, it says March.
Interesting.
Why? That's fascinating. Don't know why. Anyway, moving on. The main image on the cover. Supergirl is flying over a city. She's holding a young man wearing white jeans, white shoes, it looks like. He's got a red jumper on that says Prez USA on it. He has long flowing blonde locks. And this boy is pleading to Supergirl.
Supergirl, don't drop me!
And Supergirl looks down on him and says,
I have my orders, Prez.
gasp, it's Prez. We are doing Prez.
Yes, we're doing Prez. Now, I'm quickly scrolling back through my phone, Peter, and can confirm quite a few months ago, in fact, looking at my phone, it was May of last year, I right-clicked, after finding it on the web, the original cover art for issue 10.
Oh.
And that has the date March on it as well.
Ah.
So obviously the trade paperback must have taken it from the original art. Now the interesting thing here, we'll get this bit out of the way. Issue 10 of Supergirl published June 74. Issue 9 of Supergirl was published way back on the 27th of September 1973. 9 months to the day. So obviously this one might have sat on the shelf for a while. And the character of Prez, issue 1 of his comic was published in May 1973, and issue 4 only made it to 4 issues. Issue 4 was published, according to the priceless resource that is Mike's Amazing World of Comics. Issue 4 was published on the 15th of November, 73. So it's entirely possible that this one may have been scheduled to come out cover dated in March, but for some reason sat on the shelf for a little bit longer.
I think so. The cover date discrepancy certainly seems to hold that theory true.
Little bit of unexpected archaeology there. The interesting thing we should obviously mention this time, of course, is that by this point, Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen, metamorphosized into Superman Family, and Supergirl and Lois Lane are about to both be cancelled because their adventures will continue in Superman Family. So it's all in flux, you know? A lot of things are happening.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating.
So yes, Prez then. Prez. Peter, who's the first president of the United States that you have any actual sort of memory of?
Jimmy Carter, it would be.
Yeah, I'm the same.
You're the same, yeah. I don't remember much about him from my childhood, but yeah, it's Jimmy Carter.
Yeah. I remember him in the same way that I can remember when Margaret Thatcher won the UK election in 1979. I remember somebody on Nationwide sort of lamenting James Callaghan sort of leaving government.
Okay.
I have a memory of Mr. Carter being on the news, but of course his successor was obviously, you know, enjoyed an enormously high sort of profile in the 80s.
Yeah.
But Prez, listeners, was a title created by Joe Simon and Jerry Grandinetti.
Yay.
And it's interesting because it's very much, to use a term Peter and I loathe, but is used by a lot of the contemporary correspondence and letters pages in the comics we've been doing the last couple of years. It's very much comics with an X.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
It's not your standard DC Comics superhero fare.
Mm-hmm.
The only real sort of mention of a DC Comics superhero is in issue 1 when you see a copy of a comic called Batgirl on the desk of the big bad of Prez, who's a character called Boss Smiley, who basically has a big smiley face button for a head. Prez is basically the conceit for this series, the premise, if you will, that obviously in the wake of all the sort of, shall we say, the unsettled quality of American politics in the early 70s, Richard Nixon, Watergate, etc., after Vietnam, after the hippie movement, all that. The hook of Prez is basically 18-year-olds have all got the vote, but they also adjust so that 18-year-olds can enter Congress. And obviously following on from the sort of, if you like, the spirit and ethos of Joe Simon's earlier Brother Power the Geek, the conceit is that basically an 18-year-old gets voted in as president. There's a reference in issue 1 to Central City, if you want to factor that into what's going on. And it's probably safe to say that this is not a standard DC comic set in a standard sort of DC universe, as it were.
Yeah.
We will discuss that after the story, though. Central City is run by Boss Smiley, who, as well as having a Batgirl comic on his desk, he has a signed photograph of him with Adolf Hitler.
Of course.
And a signed photograph of him with Richard Nixon. And Boss Smiley basically encourages a young kid called Prez Rickard, who has made a bit of a name for himself by repairing all of the clocks in his hometown. He encourages Prez Rickard to run for the Senate, blah, blah, blah. Prez ends up being president. So what you get is 4 issues, and issue 5 was prepared but wasn't published, ended up in Cancel Comics Cavalcade, but is collected in this trade paperback that Peter's reading from today. You get a few issues of a very idealistic young man, obviously riding the counterculture wave of youth resistance to the older age group. And it's interesting reading, because I had owned, like many of the comics that Peter and I cover on this podcast, I have owned the full run for decades, but I'd never read it before, or read it all in preparation for this. I was really struck by it. It wasn't quite as naive and sort of optimistic as I thought it would be.
No.
Prez makes a friend very early on, a guy called Eagle Free, who's a Native American young man sort of thing. And there's lots of very pointed sort of political comments and satire. Issue 2 is some stuff with human chess. Issue 3 has got stuff about a gun control bill, which is obviously still hyper-relevant in America now, like over 50 years later.
Of course, yeah. In the world now.
Exactly, but one thing that's very interesting is the series goes on, Prez sort of becomes less idealistic as he goes. He sort of concedes that sometimes you have to resort to violence and guns and stuff, and that's quite interesting. It's almost in a way was Joe Simon, who, let's be honest, was not a young man by the time this comic was out. Was Joe Simon sort of having a pop at the younger generation at the same time as trying to celebrate and encourage them?
Yeah.
It's a very interesting series. I first became aware of Prez in an issue of the Neil Gaiman Sandman, but we'll save the discussion of that until after we've done the story. So, as I was sort of saying, there's no real sense that this is taking place in any real DC continuity, which is why we're doing issue 10, because it obviously brings in Supergirl. So, for the benefit of the listeners, what kind of recent precedent has there been for the depiction of the president in contemporary DC comics?
Well, at that time, it was Richard Nixon who was president. Now, he had several appearances round about this time.
Yeah.
Starting off in World's Finest, number 189, which came out on the 11th of September 1969. The story was The Man with Superman's Heart.
Gosh.
Now, it's quite dark. Nixon appears on the television announcing Superman's death.
Right.
Luthor gets Superman's body and sells off his organs to the Big Four syndicates.
Okay.
So far, so horrible. But it turns out it's not Superman. It was actually all a hoax to draw out the leaders of the syndicates that Batman and Superman were trying to capture.
Okay.
So, what a relief, Superman's not dead.
Yes, goodness.
This is just a few of them, there were loads. The next one's Action Comics 390.
Yeah.
Out on the 28th of May 1970, The Self-Destruct Superman. This is really interesting because it's Superman had actually given a Superman elimination machine that he'd created to the White House in case he went out of control. And it was accidentally activated, and obviously he has to deal with the repercussions of that. It's one of these stories where it's kind of like a shadowy figure as the president sort of thing, and it's not hugely said that it's Nixon outright, but it's a good one. Yeah,
I've got a copy of 390 in front of me, listeners. It's one of the POTUS-themed covers that I'm going to throw up as bonus content this week. I'll hold it up for the benefit of Peter and our YouTube viewers right now. But yeah, it's because it's not very clear in the cover at all who that is that sat in the Oval Office, but it's interesting very much, yes.
Cool. Next one I'm going to mention is Jimmy Olsen 132. Out on the 14th of July 1970.
Right.
The story's called The Winner's Prize, The Loser's Grave.
Gosh.
Classic Jimmy Olsen story. Russia and America both have a champion that they select to fight, and the winner gets ownership of a strategic island for their nation. And of course, Jimmy is chosen as the American champion. Typical Jimmy Olsen story.
That's very interesting because issue 132 obviously is the last issue before Kirby came on board.
Yes,
And mention of Kirby, if I can preempt you slightly, the cover of issue 8 of Commandy. There's another one of the POTUS-themed covers that I'm going to post on the socials this week. We see Commandy running through a sort of room which has giant statue busts of what looks to my eyes like clearly Kennedy, Nixon, and I'm guessing might be LBJ.
Cool. The next one I'm going to mention is World's Finest 196, a story called The Kryptonite Express, out on the 23rd of July 1970. In this story, this is quite cool, a hail of kryptonite meteors hits US soil, and Nixon arranges a clean-up operation to protect the Man of Steel. And he uses a train that they all nickname the Kryptonite Express to collect it all.
Interesting.
Yeah. Such a good guy, that Nixon. Next issue is Wonder Woman 196, out on the 1st of July 1971. Target for Today is the title. That's the one with the famous cover of Wonder Woman, Diana Prince, it's during her powerless phase.
Right.
With the exposed back strapped up with like the target on her back.
Sure. Yes, I think I've got a copy of that one.
Yeah. As I said, during her powerless Emma Peel style era.
Sure.
She foils an assassination attempt on Nixon in that story.
Right.
Which is pretty cool.
Okay.
And the last one I'm going to mention is Wonder Woman 224, out on the 18th of March 76. Wonder Woman versus the United States. In that, she's got her powers back, but she's falsely imprisoned as part of a renegade's Amazon's attempt to take over Paradise Island. So yeah, that's all the sort of the contemporary appearances really of Nixon. But there's loads of post-crisis ones, including appearances in Hellblazer, the Ostrander Spectre series, the Silver Age 80-page Giant, the Dave Gibbons, Steve Root, World's Finest Mini, and the 90s Night Force series, and also in an All-Star Squadron annual, but that's kind of like a flashback before he was president, so...
My sort of favourite Nixon comic appearance around this time is on the cover of issue 17 of From Beyond the Unknown.
Ah.
Some aliens sort of pointing at an image of Nixon on the screen, which is actually a reprint of a story from issue 30 of Mystery in Space, which first time round featured Eisenhower.
Ah, there you go.
So they repurposed it and used a different POTUS. I love that sort of recycling. Genius.
Excellent.
So it's basically, as Peter said there is a lot of evidence, if you like, in contemporary DC Universe Earth 1 stories that Richard Nixon was the president, which makes Supergirl 10 all the more interesting, and frankly, it's why we've decided to cover this one. But also, in the post-issue discussion, there will be some other stuff that's relevant to what we cover. So, without any further ado, shall we get stuck into Supergirl issue 10?
Let's do so.
Our opening splash image is kind of similar to the cover. Supergirl could well be standing in one of the buildings in the background. There's certainly something that looks a bit Empire State to one of the buildings in the cover. One thing I like about the cover, it's almost as if Prez is gripping on to Supergirl's fingers for dear life, as if he's about to slip and fall.
Yeah.
And what we see in the opening splash panel, Supergirl's holding Prez under the arm as she sort of alights at the summit of this very tall building. We can see fighter jets buzzing around. It's almost like the tail end of King Kong.
It is, yeah.
And Supergirl is holding Prez at the top of this building, and she's saying, "Nothing can stop me from carrying out my orders to let you go. Now, Prez." Prez looking down, looking panicked. Supergirl looking weirdly focused. And a large caption box at the bottom of the page reads,
"From Julius Caesar on, the great and the highest offices have been the targets of ruthless plotters. Now Supergirl herself becomes the irresistible instrument of destruction in the startling plot of the century.
Death of a Prez."
Prez.
And interestingly, this story is written by
Carrie Bates.
who's recently appeared on the show, sort of.
He has indeed, yes. And art is by Art Saf and Vincent Coletta.
Wonderful. Right, into the story properly. A scene-setting caption then for the first panel of page 2.
At Van Dyer University, Linda Danvers' attention is riveted to the TV set in her dorm. A scene duplicated throughout the country.
Yes, we see Linda and a few of her pals sat about on seats and on the floor and standing around watching the large television in the corner where we can see the TV newsreader who's saying,
"And now, ladies and gentlemen, the chief executive of our land speaking to you before a supermarket in Rosedale."
Yes, and we cut to presumably what's the view on the television. We can see a crowd standing outside a branch of Supermart. Listeners, American listeners, was Supermart the name of a chain? I don't know. Ross, Steve, can you let us know? Crowd are all standing around watching, and we can see the young, blonde-haired, immaculately coiffured figure of Prez. A blonde-haired man in the crowd says,
"3 cheers for Prez!"
We see Prez waving to the crowd, and he's saying, "Save your cheers until I can bring food prices down, folks. There's got to be a reason for their skyrocketing. I'll find it before a hot dog costs as much as a steak." And a very cheery, curly-haired, wide-faced young man in the crowd cries,
"Hooray for Prez! He'll do it too!"
Yeah, and we see Prez mingling with the crowd. There's some great 70s-looking people. There's a man with glasses and slick-backed hair and a striped shirt and a yellow tie. There's a girl with blonde hair with a pink headband, some other loud shots and stuff going on. We see Prez mingling with the crowd, and beside him, there's a man with a very neat moustache and dark hair wearing a sort of yellow and black checked cravat and a sort of turquoise safari suit. Ugh. And making his way towards Prez through the crowd is an older-looking chap. To me, it looks a little bit like a Johnny Thunderous who he's gone to see. A man in a brown suit with a large sort of pinky-purple bow tie who's reaching out with his hand and he's saying,
"Let me through, please. I promised my kid I'd shake Prezzy's hand."
And we cut back to Linda at home, watching on television, who gets an extreme close-up as she looks very concerned and thinks, "Great Krypton!"
While Linda's classmates watch the TV screen.
Yes, we hear the TV announcer continuing.
It's amazing how many people want to shake Prez's hand.
As Linda takes her leave. Now, Linda looks astonishing here with her pink headband and her pink blouse and her white and pink striped trousers. Superb. Linda takes her leave from the room, thinking, "I'd better shake the dust off this dorm from my heels before..."
Unobserved, Linda Danvers makes a lightning change and bolts skyward in the celebrated costume of Supergirl.
Yes, we see Supergirl flying through the air, thinking, "This is one time I wish my microscopic vision didn't reveal the real scene I spotted on TV. That the love Prez feels for the people isn't returned by everyone. But there's a rattler in every crowd."
Vast seas melt before the mighty maid.
And we see her flying down to arrive outside the big branch of Supermart. We can see the crowd, we can see all the big cars and stuff. And in panel 3, we see Prez about to shake hands with the older man with the bow tie, who's reaching for Prez and saying,
"You don't know what it will mean to me to shake your hand, Prez. I've missed you all the other times you spoke." Suddenly...
and a voice says, "You're going to miss again!" Prez exclaims, "Supergirl!" And we see Supergirl shoving the man with the bow tie and the brown suit back as from his wrist there's a kapow sound effect and a splat sound effect as a bullet collides with Supergirl's tummy. He'd a hidden gun up his sleeve. Goodness me! The balding man with the bow tie exclaims,
"Blast you, Supergirl! How did you know?"
"Simple. My X-ray vision spotted the gun hidden in your sleeve." Well done, Supergirl. So glad you were there. We arrive at the top of page 4.
As the thwarted assassin is led away by the police.
Yes, we see him being led away in the background. Supergirl is conversing with Prez and she's saying, "You've got to watch it, Prez." "Thanks, Supergirl. But if I hid behind stone walls, I wouldn't be much of a president, would I? No, to be in touch with the people, I've got to be within reach of them." And in panel 2, we see a little boy tugging at Prez's jumper, and he's saying,
"Prez, Prez."
And then in the next panel, as Supergirl looks on, we see the little boy handing something to Prez.
"This is my daddy's watch, Prez. It stopped when he died in Vietnam. No one could fix it, but my mama says you can fix any clock. Can you make it run again? Can you?"
Prez bends down, takes the watch from the little boy, saying, "I'll sure try, son. I love to tinker with clocks." In the next panel, we see he's opened the watch up already, saying, "You'd be amazed what a thin dial can do. In the right place." And Supergirl, watching this, is thinking, "What is amazing is the way Prez is handling that watch with the touch of a surgeon." And at the final panel of page 5, there's a lovely tick-tock sound effect as Prez holds the watch up to the little boy's ear. He's got it working again. Fantastic. The little boy's delighted. He says,
"Gosh, Prez, you made my papa's watch work. Thanks."
And this takes us to the top of page 5, where a caption reads,
As the news media surrounds Supergirl and Prez.
Yes, we can see photographers buzzing around, policemen holding back the crowd, and Supergirl saying, "The country needs you, Prez. There are cranks in every crowd. Be careful." "I'm no turtle, Supergirl. I can't grow a bulletproof shell to hide under." And as Supergirl takes her leave in panel 2, Prez waves after her saying, "Anyway, no more speeches. I'm going right back to the White House to fight for clean air for this country. Kids should grow up without having to breathe in poison." And Supergirl also waves as she takes her leave and she says, "Right on, Prez." In the next panel, we see her flying through the air as Prez departs in his vehicles, and Supergirl observes, "There goes a presidential caravan. If love can steer this country back on the right track, Prez can do it. If he's not derailed." And another slow dissolve.
Mile after mile unwinds beneath the wheels of the presidential cars until...
Yes, we see the car driving along the wide empty road, and we see a sign sort of strung between a couple of trees, and the sign reads, "Auction, Rare Antique Clocks, Last Day." And from inside his vehicle, we see Prez reading the sign, and he says, "An auction of rare antique clocks. I can't miss that. Maybe I can buy one that doesn't work and make it tick."
As Prez happily wanders from one unique display to the next.
First panel of page 6, we see Prez inside the barn where the clock exhibition or sale, whatever it is going on. We can see all sorts of clocks with very interesting designs. We can see one clock, there's a sort of old sailing ship on top of it, one which is a model guillotine. One that looks like a knight in armour at the top of the watch face. One that looks like it's a sort of devil holding up his trident, bursting out the sort of flames that surround the clock face.
There's an hourglass in the top right-hand corner.
So there is.
I wonder if Rex Tyler's been here, or indeed the Sandman.
Yes, with all the TikToks floating about, it could well be. Yeah, just basically lots of different clocks of lots of different sizes. And as he's taking all of this in, Prez is saying, every clock seems to be in perfect working order. Then he notices another sort of square one, which seems to be at a different time from all the others, and he says, except this one. I'll bid for it. The hands seem to be stuck together. Might just need a bit of oiling.
Suddenly,
a voice cries, hands off, Prez! And the clock vanishes from in front of him, and we see Supergirl flying up towards the roof of the barn with the clock in her hands. Prez cries after her, Supergirl, what are you doing here? I've just outbid you, Prez. With a crack, she busts through the roof of the barn, flying up into the air, and there's a massive wham as she hurls the clock away, and it explodes, and she thinks, it's a good thing I kept my eye on Prez, or his time might have run out. Gosh, someone was trying to kill Prez. Good grief, we arrive at top of page 7. A caption reads,
unharmed by the deadly explosion, the Maid of Steel returns.
Yeah, she alights in front of Prez. There's some TV cameras there, inexplicably. Maybe this was a big deal.
Maybe it's the Antiques Roadshow on tour.
Maybe that's what it is. Yeah, maybe that's what it is.
Of course.
When did the Antiques Roadshow start? We'll have to look that up before the end of the episode. We can see a sign behind it that says auction last day, so it's well timed. Supergirl lands beside Prez, and Prez is saying, thanks, Supergirl. That's twice you saved my life. I hope the third time won't be fatal. I've lots of work to do. Supergirl replies, there's a pattern to these attempts, Prez. The plotters seem to know your route.
At that moment, watching the broadcast in a secret lab far from the scene.
Yes, this is a great-looking secret lab. Lots of valves and screens and displays and what looks like spinning tape spools. We can see Supergirl flying Prez along on one of the screens, and she's saying, suppose I fly you back to the White House, Prez. Great, he replies. The plotters would never expect that switch, Supergirl, and we see that they're being watched by a man with very neat dark hair, black moustache, and a slight overbite. He looks very much like the man who was standing next to Prez in the crowd earlier on. Whether or not it's him, I don't know. We don't really get told. And this man, who doesn't actually get named in the story, annoyingly, is also in the company of an older-looking figure with long white hair, who's standing watching also what's going on the screens. Now, the figure with the moustache and the overbite kind of looks a bit like Terry Thomas or a bit like Dick Dastardly. Let's see how that influences Peter's performance. This man turns to the elderly figure and says,
Supergirl doesn't realise it, but the first two attempts were bait, and she's bitten. The real assassin will be inside the White House. Supergirl herself. Ready, Hepzibah?
aye, replies the white-haired figure.
Perform your evil magic, Hepzibah.
And we see that Hepzibah has a little Supergirl voodoo doll in their hand. And Hepzibah has a large needle, which he's just shoved through the head of the Supergirl doll, saying, "'Tis done. Supergirl, I am now your will. You must obey me. Kill Prez. Kill." In the first panel now of page 8, we see the man with the dark hair and the neat moustache moving to another part of his room, which it's almost in the same way that an observatory would have a big sort of hatch in the roof. We can see that a window is open and there's a bald man sat. It's almost like a massive gun that he's aiming out of this window, but it doesn't look like it's a sort of, shall we say, a military gun. It looks a bit more scientific. There's another man standing next to it with a clipboard. We can see more dials and spools and stuff behind. But the man with the moustache is pointing up into the sky through the open window and saying,
"I get $1 million a contract by combining black magic with the wizardry of science. Radar to pinpoint my target, and a surgical laser probe to inflame the aggressive portion of the brain to kill."
And he gets a massive close-up in panel 2 as he says,
"Target, Supergirl. Fire cranial cannon."
Well, that's obviously what we saw in panel 1 then, isn't it? It's the cranial cannon, the caption for panel 3 of page 8.
Meanwhile, as Supergirl hurtles through the skies on a long trip eastwards back to the White House.
Yes, we can see her carrying Prez under her arms. They're approaching the building that we saw in the splash panel, the one that looks like the building in the background of the cover. And Supergirl is flying along, and she's saying, "Great Krypton! I'm being tracked by some dark force. It's tearing at my brain." And as she says that, she alights at the top of this very tall Empire State Building type tower. We can see that she's holding Prez at this point basically by the scruff of his neck. And in the final panel of page 8, she's holding him out over the edge of the building. He's dangling, virtually. Logopolis, almost, you might say. And Supergirl continues saying, commanding me to kill you.
A passing helicopter reports the incredible scene, and moments later, swift jets arrive.
Yes, it's very, very King Kong, isn't it? We can see Supergirl silhouette, still holding the silhouetted form of Prez, as two fighter jets fly into view. The first pilot can be heard saying,
Green Leader to Jove Control, Supergirl at top tower, threatening Prez as reported. Over.
And we hear coming over the radio the reply that says, Jove Control to Green Leader, drive her down, over.
As the planes attack the Maid of Steel...
Yes, we see the planes obviously firing on Supergirl, and some various vip-vip and zing and pew sound effects. But then Supergirl leaps away from top of the building, still holding on to Prez, and she says, they can't stop me. Bullets don't frighten me.
Supergirl evades the aerial pursuers with a super burst of speed.
Yes, we can see she's now flying Prez over a very large bridge. We can see cars on the bridge, we can see water underneath, and Supergirl is saying, nothing can stop me from carrying out the command to kill Prez. And with that, she lets go, and Prez falls down towards the water. Oh my goodness, it's a brilliant perspective in this panel. Hopefully there'll be room for this one on the socials. We arrive at the top of page 10.
Shortly, in the Master Killer's hideout...
Is that what he's called? I don't know. There's an inset panel of this mustachioed Master Killer as he says,
I should give Supergirl a commission for carrying out my contract to hit the Prez. Ha! Ha ha ha!
But then he looks around, and we can see that the skylight window is still open, and something is happening to the cranial cannon. It's turned yellow, and it's, well, very helpfully, the Master Killer tells us,
Something's melting the radar cranial cannon.
Gosh, the caption for panel 2 reads,
Appearing that same instant like an avenging hurricane...
Yes, Supergirl presumably flies in through the open window, sending everyone flying, and the Master Killer man says,
Supergirl, how did you find us?
I used my X-ray vision to home in on your radar beam until I tracked you here, and a burst of heat vision to destroy your infernal device. Infernal device, I like it. The caption for panel 3.
As police, summoned by Supergirl, take away the plotters...
Lots of references to the plotters in this issue, the excellent Doctor Who novel by Gareth Roberts. We see the Master Killer being led away by a policeman and an incredibly pert Supergirl watching him go as the Master Killer says,
Anyway, you failed to stop me, Supergirl. The radio broadcasted you dropped Prez from a mile high.
Gosh, I forgot about that. It's a good thing there's a slow dissolve.
But later, a startling broadcast.
Yes, and we see Prez, seemingly restored, in his red jumper and everything, sat behind a big desk with a TV camera pointing at him. And he's concluding by saying, and so, Supergirl flew me to safety to the Fortress of Solitude while she used a plastic replica of me to deceive the gang. He turns to Supergirl who's standing at his left and he says, you sure put in a hard day's work, Supergirl. How do you feel? And our heroine gets a close-up to round things out as she says, fine, Prez. I had a slight headache, but it went away. And a small caption reads,
Only magic is mighty enough to affect Supergirl, but right is mightier.
And another, even smaller, diamond-shaped caption tells us we have reached
The end.
Well then, lots to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Nice that they pick up on the clock fixing thing, which is such a big deal.
Yes, from issue 1 of Prez, yeah.
Where he fixes every clock in his hometown. Of Steadfast, which just says everything you really need to know about him. Really, doesn't it?
Yep.
Lots of full moons in issue of Prez, by the way, listeners, so if you're ever going to read it, stand by for that. I like the clock recurring motif. That adds a little bit of continuity.
Yeah.
It's interesting that it's written by Carrie Bates and not written by Joe Simon.
Joe Simon, yeah.
Joe Simon's collaborator, obviously, on Prez, as I think I said, was Jerry Grandinetti, who we know from his work on The Spectre, but also he and Joe together would produce Green Team.
Of course, yes.
In first issue special, which, to be honest, is in a very similar vibe to Prez, and I would be prepared to assert that it's in the same continuity, but that's just me.
Makes sense.
And I think it's also probably fair to say that this was prepped, presumably as some kind of crossover sales boost attempt.
Yeah, I can see that.
For the series, and as we said, the fact that it came out 7 months later than it was possibly originally planned, maybe backs that up. Maybe they realised that Prez wasn't selling so well and there wasn't going to be much point putting this one out.
And Supergirl perhaps wasn't selling so well either, hence Superman Family, so yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's it. And of course, the 9-month gap between this one and issue 9. Yeah, there's not too much to the story, really. I think it's obviously just there as a bit of cross-promotional work, but I mean, I can remember when Reagan was shot at and all this sort of stuff, you know? we all know what happened to Kennedy, like just over 10
Oh,
years
do
before
we?
this was published. Oh, do we? Yeah, I've been rewatching Quantum Leap. Listeners, if you've never seen the Quantum Leap episode that deals with the Kennedy assassination, you really should, because it'll mess with your head when you get to the end and you realise what Sam was actually doing there.
And Red Dwarf also did a very fun Kennedy assassination story. If you can have such a thing as a fun Kennedy assassination story.
So yes, assassination on the Prez and rescued by a superhero is probably an obvious thing to do in a story.
Yeah.
As I said, reading the 4 issues that made up the Prez series, it really does exist in a separate reality of itself.
Mm-hmm.
There's no real sense that it's part of the main DCU. The fact that one city is called Central City, I don't really think we're supposed to believe it's taking place where Barry Allen lives.
Yeah.
So the obvious thing we have to postulate then is that either the Prez stories did all happen on Earth 1,
Mm-hmm.
and because obviously Supergirl is the younger cousin of the Superman of Earth 1.
Yep.
Or, as Peter said, there were plenty of stories with Richard Nixon.
Mm-hmm.
Plenty of stories with Richard Nixon featured. So, do we dare suggest that Prez takes place in another continuity, another continuum, another universe, and that it's the Supergirl of this other universe, this other Earth, that's appearing in Supergirl issue 10?
It kind of has to be, hasn't it? Because it doesn't make
think
any
so.
sense for Prez Rickard to be the president on Earth 1. I mean, after this, he's not really in any pre-crisis continuity.
No.
So it does make the most sense that this is Prez's Earth. But does that mean, as well as Supergirl, there's also Superman
It's possible. I suppose there has to be.
on that Earth? Is there a whole Justice League? Are there more superheroes?
I mean, the DC fandom wiki postulates that this is all taking place, the Prez series in this issue of Supergirl takes place on Earth 72.
Ah, okay.
It's a nightmare to navigate on my phone. You can't close adverts, it freezes and all that sort of stuff. It sort of seems to say that Prez's Earth is Earth 72. Where they get that from, I'm not sure, because the comic was published, obviously, in 1973. Was there a presidential election in 1972? I think that maybe
Could be.
is probably the closest sort of thing.
Mhm.
Because obviously Nixon resigned
Mhm.
in August 1974. When, obviously everything with the Watergate came out, which is another thing that Quantum Leap did very, very early on. I've got episode 2 or 3 or something like that, I think, did a setting up at the Watergate sort of thing. Nixon was obviously still incumbent when these were published. So, yeah, Earth 72, there's nothing in the comics that suggests Earth 72. You could use that number if you like. It's all very arbitrary at this point.
It is fascinating to think that the Master Killer, for lack of a better name, could be the guy standing beside Prez
Yeah.
during the first assassination attempt. Is he there to make sure it happens? It seems a bit strange putting himself in harm's way.
Yeah.
Or is he there influencing this guy? Is this guy hypnotised by Hepzibah as well? And been given this wrist gun?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was sort of wondering, because we're not really told who he is or what his relationship is with Prez.
Yeah.
The fact that he's so close to Prez in this early panel made me think, is he a member of Prez's staff who's betraying him?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And as you say, is he on site to make sure it happens, that everything goes according to plan? I mean, that's quite a dastardly sort of way of doing it. I've always got the fear whenever I see, politicians and members of the royal family doing sort of public appearances, because you always think about what happened to John Lennon, quite frankly.
Yeah.
I've always got the fear of people sort of walking in public and, anything could happen to them. The Master Killer, I mean, he's obviously got resources because he's got his equipment and the cranial cannon, and he's obviously got some relations with some elderly voodoo priest
Yes.
who randomly pops up for 2 panels and sticks a needle in his Supergirl doll. There's a lot sort of crammed in and a lot left to be interpreted, I think, rather than sort of spelled out. It's very interesting.
I mean, for only a 10-page story, they have to do a lot of shorthand in this. And I love the comment where he says, combining black magic with the wizardry of science. He's almost like this Earth's version of Doctor Doom, because that's what he does.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair as well, because, voodoo and all that, it kind of riffs a little bit with some of the other stuff. I mean, have you read the Prez series yourself, the original Prez series?
Yes, I've got all the issues. I read them many, many years ago, and
Yeah.
I started to reread and prep for this, but I didn't get hugely far. I got halfway through issue 2.
Yes, because at the point of recording, Peter is still editing JLE 113.
Yes, and have been for quite some time.
Yes, we all know it'll be worth it, and we all thank Peter for his efforts. What was I saying? Yeah, I mean, all that we really needed was them to fly over the Bermuda Triangle towards the end, for it to be just the 70s with the voodoo thing. I mean, the King Kong homages are kind of obvious as well.
Yeah.
And for a Carrie Bates story, it's quite straightforward in a way, but
Yeah.
if this is supposed to be some kind of attempt at mixing things up cosmically, then it's probably a good thing that he was on it, because we know from recent experience that he he is previous with such things.
He certainly does. In fact, it's Cary Bates actually reminds me a wee bit of his New Adventures of Superboy series. Although it's the President, it still feels kind of like small scale and quite basic in storytelling and stuff. And a lot of that is kind of like boiled down into what was happening in his Smallville Superboy stories, which was tons of fun. I love that series so much. But he wrote a vast chunk of it.
Yeah, we'll be doing at least a couple of issues of that series when we get to it. A couple of stories from that, listeners. Start collecting now. I think we have to agree that this was an attempt to boost the sales of the comic of Prez, and the fact that it came out 7 or 8 months or so after the series already finished just makes me think it was bought and paid for. We'd better use it.
Yeah,
sort of thing.
Definitely.
And as we've said, the fact we've discovered that the original art and the reprint and the trade uses a March cover date as opposed to the October cover date that actually ended up with, that fascinates me.
Yeah.
So yeah, Prez would reappear, listeners. The first time I encountered them, as I think I mentioned earlier, was issue 54 of Neil Gaiman's Sandman, published in August 1993, which is a very, very interesting one. I reread this in preparation as well. It's the one that has the sort of manipulated photograph of Bill Clinton on the cover.
Yeah.
So it was all very topical. And it kind of basically retells and folds the events of the Prez series into sort of the regular continuity, I suppose, with the fact that obviously the caveat that the Sandman Vertigo series is one step removed from the DCU.
Yeah. What's
very interesting is that there's some panels in the Sandman issue which are basically just redrawn versions of panels from the original Prez series.
Yeah.
The bulk of the story is drawn by Mike Aldred, and it's gorgeous. If you can get a hold of this trade, I would recommend it.
Yeah.
Nixon, amusingly enough, does appear in it. There's a scene where he sort of talks to Prez and stuff. What's very significant, and these panels will end up on our socials, issue 54 features appearances from Wildcat, one-time JSA member and source of much "what earth is this story taking place on" anyway confusion in the podcast already, so it's quite fitting. Another reason for us to do this, Wildcat pops up because Prez's wife gets killed by an obsessive fan of Ted Grant, but Wildcat pops up in a couple of panels. I will stick them on the socials alongside the cover for this one, just for some more GSA-related content. When we get to the end of the Sandman story, we're sort of given the impression that Dream has sort of rescued Prez from death and allowed him to keep wandering through many parallel versions of America to paraphrase Quantum Leap and put things right that might go wrong or bring inspiration to Americas that maybe need it. It's all very political and it's much of a parable, like a lot of Sandman stuff is, but it's interesting. It's very, in a similar way to the way that Neil rescued the Kirby Sandman and folded that into continuity, he does the same thing with Prez.
Yeah.
Another publication that riffed on the whole Prez thing was an issue of their Vertigo Visions series. Prez's issue of that was published in July 1995. Quite a while after the Sandman, and it's subtitled "Smells Like Teen President." So that's obviously about a year and a bit after the death of Kurt Cobain. And there's a Nirvana bumper sticker on the car on the cover, so that says all you really need to know. And it's a very, very non-fantastical, very realistic sort of story of a young man who thinks he's the son of Prez and is basically journeying through America to try and find them. I hadn't read this since the comic came out, and I really enjoyed reading it again. Very, very good. It was written by Ed Brubaker, and I would encourage you listeners, if you haven't already got a copy of the Prez First Teen President trade, to seek it out or maybe to try and nab some of these comics, because it's all very, very interesting.
And that was Prez for quite some time until August 2015, when Mark Russell, who I think this is one of his earliest stories, one of my favourite writers, he relaunched Prez with a brand new version updated for now, or at least as now as 2015 was. It was originally intended as a 12-issue series, ended up being a 6-issue series. Corn Dog in Chief is the name of the first collection, and this is wonderful. It is an absolutely scathing, biting satire. In this story, set in the near future of America, the elections are held pretty much by Twitter.
Pretty much, yeah.
And there's this girl who is known as Corn Dog Girl. Her name's Beth.
She goes viral in the very modern sense and gets a bit of a profile.
After she gets her hair stuck in a corn dog grill.
As you do.
This becomes a viral thing, and basically she accidentally gets elected through her own popularity of this video.
Yeah.
And she has to kind of deal with the consequences of that because she's president.
Yes.
So I read this when it first came out and absolutely adored every single page. It was a 6-issue series. And then much later on, there was like a backup story that was in the Catwoman election special. And fortunately, all of that is going to be collected in a new volume, which might actually be out by the time this episode goes out.
Yeah, I've seen solicitations for it. I think it's due out in the early part of the summer. I mean, I'd never read this series before.
Mm-hmm.
I acquired it and read it in preparation. Listeners, we're recording this on Thursday afternoon, Thursday the 18th of April. I read it all in one go on Sunday night.
Wow.
I texted Peter and said, "This is fantastic." And Peter was like, "I know." And I said, "Listen, it's so good. I'm nipping around to Lasani for some pakora so I can put my feet up and really savour it." And savour it I did. Railed through it. And it's a shame that, they didn't get a chance to continue it. The story in the backup of the Catwoman election night special basically continues more or less straight from it. Very pointy observations about, again, super relevant to stuff that's happening in the States just now, stuff to do with birth control and women's rights and what have you.
Birth control and gun control in the same story, great.
Yeah. What I found really interesting was set in the near future, and obviously the fact that Twitter is now called X, but it's, as Pete said, it's a very sharp satire on modern culture and just the effects of sort of social media on politics and how much that sort of thing is taken into account. I mean, as Pete said, Beth sort of becomes elected almost by accident because there's so much manoeuvring going on between the other political parties and the people and the Republicans and Democrats to try and, if you give us your college vote, we'll give you this, and someone else is holding out for this because they've been promised it. And it all ends up sort of happening almost by accident that Beth gets more votes than she becomes.
They kind of use her as a bargaining chip. It's like a threat to say, well, if you don't vote for my guy, then she's going to go in.
Exactly.
But it happens once too often, and she becomes president.
Yeah. Obviously, we're not going to get too political, but it's fascinating watching what's going on in America at the moment. We shall see. I mean, I went to see the movie Civil War at the Flicks the other night, and what's interesting is it seems to have been sold over here in a very different way from what I can gather, what the trailers were like in the States. The trailers in the States seem to emphasise it as a story about some photojournalists during a time of war, whereas the trailers over here really seem to say hey, we know America's an absolute state. This is something that could happen.
Fascinating.
Listeners, the short version of all this is we think that Prez was in another continuity and that there was a Supergirl in that Prez, and there might even have been a Wildcat as well, going by what Neil Gaiman and Mike Allred say in the Sandman. And every issue of the Prez series, both of them, are really, really good, and we think you should track them down.
Certainly do. And a big thank you, of course, to Mark Russell, the writer of Prez, who joined us voicing the newsreader this episode. Thank you very much, Mark.
Yes, many thanks.
And listeners, I met writer Mark Russell several years ago now, back when he was doing the late lamented Forbidden Planet International podcast. And I interviewed him for our 100th episode of that show at a con in London. And we talked not just about Prez, but about all the work he'd done at that point. And as a little bonus, I'm going to add it post-credits to this very episode. So stay tuned. Stay tuned.
Yes. Thanks, Mark, for taking the time to talk to Peter all those years ago. And Mark, honestly, if you're listening, thanks as well for Beth, because that series was terrific. I really hope that the new collection does well enough that you're allowed to continue it. Obviously, an awful lot has happened in politics since. It'd be fascinating to see what you had to say about it. Particularly if you're able to use Beth again, that'd be tremendous. So, is that us? Have we covered it? I think we have. I mean, there's obviously lots of other stuff we could talk about. We could talk about Ronald Reagan's appearances in Legends and on the cover of that issue of Outsiders. But we'd be here all night.
Yep, and in Dark Knight Returns, for goodness sake.
Of course, yeah. And didn't Prez turn up in one version of one of the Frank Miller Dark Knight series? I seem to think a version of him was used.
Yes, he was in Dark Knight Strikes Again, I believe. Yeah. Now that you mention it. Gosh, I forgot all about that.
Yeah, so I don't think I'll have room on the socials for any of the Dark Knight pages. Listeners, there's plenty this week. I'm going to post all the covers of the Prez series. I've got some original art. I've got some more house ads. I've got a little pile of POTUS-themed covers that I've had pulled for years, literally, once we decided we're going to do this. I'm going to put up all the covers of the Beth Prez series. Lots and lots to look at. Peter, if people wanted to look at our socials and all the extra bonus content, where should they go?
On Facebook and Instagram, we're at the Earth 2 Podcast. On Twitter, as I'm still calling it, because that's how Beth was elected, we are at podcast_Earth2. And there were no letters for this story, because obviously the series was cancelled. But if you want to write to us, you can. You can email us at theearth2podcast@gmail.com. And it's the number 2 for all of our social media.
It certainly is. If you're feeling generous, you go to wherever it is you receive your podcasts and give us a nice review. That'd be lovely. Or you could go to our coffee page and buy Peter the price of a beverage or a packet of lockets. Listeners, I'd like to, as I often do, recommend that you listen to our pal Ross's Stop Let's Team Up. He's getting some really interesting stuff with Starman right now. And our pal Brandon, if he hasn't done so already by the time we record this, by the time we release it, he probably will have done. He'll have started his annual Summer of Box Office Flashback this year. I believe he's doing 2004. So Brandon Peters' show, go and check that out. It's been my favourite podcast for the last couple of years. It's brilliant, really, really, really interesting stuff. On that bombshell.
I've been Vice President Peter.
And I've been President David Steele. We'll see you soon on
The Earth 2 podcast.
Transmatter cube activated. Return coordinates set for Earth Prime.
Hi folks, Peter here. I'm here with Mark Russell.
Hi, Peter.
Hi there. We're at the London Film and Comic Con, that's why you can hear all this noise in the background. We're here to have a wee brief chat with Mark about his work. You first came onto my radar with Prez, to be honest, with DC, which I think was your first mainstream comic work.
That's correct.
Yeah, so how did all that come about?
It was not only my first mainstream comic, it was my first comic mainstream or not.
Oh, right.
And, yeah. I had written 2 books before that, but they weren't comics. They were both about the Bible, and they were called God is Disappointed in You and Apocrypha Now. And I thought for the longest time that this is why I got the gig at DC. Like, oh, it must be because they really enjoyed my books.
Sure.
But it wasn't until I was telling this story at San Diego Comic-Con that Marie, my editor, got up in the middle of the panel and contradicted me. She said, "No, that's not what happened at all." And she got up to the microphone and she said, "It wasn't your books at all. It was your Count Chocula fan fiction."
Your what?
Apparently I had been posting this Count Chocula fan fiction on my Facebook, and she saw that and thought, "Oh, this is the guy I want to write the Prez comic." So lucky for me, everything you do is a lottery ticket, and right time and place.
Did it have a kind of particularly satirical bent to it, or? Yeah,
it was a little satirical, but it wasn't about politics or anything. It was about Count Chocula.
Okay.
So, but she liked it enough that she decided to take a chance on me.
Fair enough.
And I got the bug. Once I started writing Prez, the thing I love about comics is not only the fact that it has an intense audience. It's not only really got a fandom, which I really enjoy, but also because it allows me to take the things that I don't enjoy about writing, which is sort of scene building and exposition, and dump that onto an artist. Which is great. So I got to focus on the things I really enjoy writing. So it's sort of the perfect medium for me.
Fantastic. One of the things that was quite evident in Prez is the satirical bent of it. Do you consider yourself a satirist, or?
I consider myself a satirist when I'm writing satire.
Okay.
But I'm not always writing satire. I'm writing Red Sonja right now for Dynamite, which is more of a historical fantasy thing. It's not really a satire. It's more about it's a fantasy story heavily endowed with moments taken from human ancient history.
Sure. Obviously, Prez led on to the Flintstones work for DC. And how did that come out? Did they contact you, or did you have pitched to them? Or?
Yeah, they contacted me. I think they're a little apologetic over the fact that Prez got canceled.
Right, because it was supposed to be 12, wasn't it?
It was supposed to be 12. It got canceled after 6. But I think that everyone there really enjoyed Prez. I don't think it was because they didn't believe in the comic. It just wasn't selling very well. So they said, well, that happens, but how would you like to write the Flintstones?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, to be honest, I'm not a big fan of the Flintstones. I don't really remember ever enjoying an episode of the Flintstones.
See, I yabba dabba don't want to write the Flintstones.
Yeah, but Dan DiDio said, "Oh, you sound perfect," because that was the last thing he wanted was somebody to write a safe sort of homage to the Flintstones.
Sure.
Which I agree, that would have been a disaster. It would have been instantly forgettable.
Absolutely.
So I said, well, if you let me write it my way, I'm happy to do it. When I'm thinking about taking on a project, what I'm really thinking about is, what will this allow me to say? How can I talk about the world through this lens? And being bedrock, the world's first civilization, I thought, well, this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about civilization and the problems with civilization that we're still dealing with today. I just sort of blamed it all on bedrock.
Well, you also did things like bring in things like corporations with Mr. Slate, and also the religious aspect. You had the whole things about kind of relationships and where actual monogamous relationships came from and whether they should exist or whatever. All that was really interesting. Also, deity worship was a main factor. And of course, war.
It's largely the story about how when people start living in large numbers, they no longer get along like they were family. Yeah. So you have to create institutions to control them, to make them pretend to like each other. And I think that's what police and religion are primarily there to do. They're there to make us pretend that we like each other, so that we don't, we make civilization tenable.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also had some amazing work with bowling ball and vacuum cleaner.
Thanks. Yeah, those are like two of the most enduring characters from the Flintstones and their appliances.
Absolutely.
But that's part of, I think, what makes them endearing is the fact that they're actually people with personalities and worldviews who are treated like appliances. Yeah. So I think everyone relates to that in one way or another.
Just the emotional impact of their story was phenomenal. You had me in tears, so be honest.
I'm both sorry and gratified by that.
And if you told me I was going to cry at Flintstones comic, I would have laughed in your face.
No, I think that's probably the best writer, or the best compliment a writer can get. It's like, you made me cry over a vacuum cleaner. But yeah, I think that what was one of the things I really wanted to accomplish with Flintstones was talk about sort of the exploitation of people around, because we just begin seeing them as not as who they are, but as the roles that make them useful to us. Yeah. And that's the tragedy of bowling ball and vacuum cleaners. They were seen by the humans only for their utility to the humans, and not as beings with hopes and dreams of their own.
Yeah. And obviously you've stayed within the realm of the cartoon tie-ins for quite some time with Snagglepuss and also some of the crossover titles, like the Huckleberry Hound, Green Lantern.
The Hanna-Barbera thing was like the best thing that ever happened to me professionally, because it was done by a big two publishers. I had the clout and the sort of publicity machine of like DC behind it, but it wasn't the mainstream DC characters. I wasn't playing with the crown jewels per se. I was more playing with the rented car. So they let me get away with a lot more. So it really was kind of like I was lucky to come in the right place at the right time to be able to work with the Hanna-Barbera properties. And the Hanna-Barbera properties allowed me to be really, I think, edgier than I could have been otherwise.
Was there not much interference from the Hanna-Barbera people about where they're...
I think they tried at first, like saying, they gave me a list of things like Fred has to say yabba dabba doo once an issue. You cannot mention any deities or political parties. And I just kind of said, well, this isn't what I signed up for. And Dan said, no, don't worry about that. Just write what you're going to write. We'll take care of the rest. And it worked out very well. So yeah, but they were pretty hands off, which was nice. I wasn't getting a bunch of notes from the licensor. But I think this is like I think when you're Hanna-Barbera, there's not a lot of pressure to interfere because there's not a lot going on right now. That, if anything, it's wise by them to take some chances to see if they can resuscitate this once lively property.
Yeah. And your Lex Luthor Porky Pig, for example, that is basically like a manual of how to create a scapegoat. So it was a really great issue as well.
Oh, so, thanks. That was like one of my favorite things I've ever been able to write. I love writing Lex Luthor. He's like probably my favorite character in the DC canon.
And again, you did the Lex Luthor roast as well. That was great. I really enjoyed that too.
Yeah, no, they let me write a couple Superman backups, which if I could choose any character to write a series about, it would be Superman.
Really? Okay.
Just because I feel like he is the ultimate thought experiment of this is what we aspire to. Yeah. This is what humanity. It's. I think in a way it's fitting that we had to create an alien to be the embodiment of all that is good about humanity. Yeah. And that's kind of the way I see Superman.
Absolutely. Moving on from DC just now to some of the other things you've worked on. Obviously, you have worked for IDW doing Judge Dredd. How did that come about?
That's the only property that I've written that I actively pitched myself.
Oh, really?
I went out because I really wanted to work with Mega City 1.
Okay.
I think for my money, it's one of the best worlds ever created in science fiction.
How did you come to that? Was that through the 2000 AD titles, or was that through IDW or through the movies? Or?
The one that I published was through IDW, but yeah, I really I love Judge Dredd from the 2000 AD stuff. That for me, that's the canon. And then I also really enjoyed the Durbin movie. Yeah. But really, I wanted it to be like sort of a more American version of the world created by 2000 AD. Yeah. To be more, I wanted Americans to read it and recognize themselves in it. Sure. And I want both as like this is a system that we live under. We're increasingly becoming a police state, and also to recognize the heroism of not just the hero of the story, but also of the people who help him.
Sure.
And to feel like that they can have some impact on their lives and on the world.
Because Dredd himself basically is always constant. He's just the immovable, figure, and it's the people around him that are, what tells the story pretty much.
Yeah. Well, I think that in a lot of ways, especially the third movie, which I loved, but it's really a story about Dredd sort of saving everyone else despite themselves.
Yeah.
It's everyone else is either like a villain or a helpless bystander.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to tell a story about people like rising to the challenge of heroism themselves, and like Dredd being there just to sort of assist them.
Yeah.
And that's what appealed to me about being able to write that specific Dredd title.
Fantastic. What brought you to the Lone Ranger as a title?
Well, again, I like to work a lot with mythologies and things that let me talk about things that aren't really unique to that title. And the Lone Ranger let me talk about the American mythology, which is the Old West. That's our sort of national mythology, the idea that, we're a country of cowboys who love freedom and wide open spaces. But really what we think of as that sort of aesthetic today is really kind of destroyed by the very people who use that imagery to sort of like promote American exceptionalism. It was when they started closing off the West to form these giant ranches, corporate farming, and that the Old West kind of died, ironically. The Old West was what came before this system that we have now.
Moving back to DC, we have been working on Wonder Twins recently, which has been phenomenal and has been extended to 12 issues now.
Yeah.
Was that a surprise? Was it originally planned as
It
12?
was a surprise because I asked initially whether or not there's any chance that Wonder Twins was going to be extended. And they kind of like replied as if I was asking if there's any chance the grass might turn blue overnight. It was like, well, there's always a chance.
Sure.
But don't like plan your mortgage around it. So when it did get extended, I was ecstatic because I've had so much fun writing Wonder Twins, and I had a lot of stories that I wasn't able to put in the first 6 issues.
Sure.
So it allows me to sort of like breathe a little bit and expand their world. So yeah, I'm really happy to. And Bendis is the one who offered me Wonder Twins. He offered me
really?
directly.
Okay. Oh wow.
Because it's his Wonder line.
Uh-huh.
And when he initially offered to me, he sounded a little apologetic, like, I got something I think you'd be great for, but, hear me out. It's the Wonder Twins. But he barely got the words Wonder Twins out of his mouth before I was like, I'll do it.
So you're familiar with the
I didn't
characters
see it as an
before,
insult
or?
at all. I love the Wonder Twins.
Uh-huh.
They're always, I think, for me, I grew up on Super Friends, and they were the most relatable people in the Super Friends because they were allowed to make mistakes. Their superheroes oftentimes didn't really help anybody, which is like one of my sort of things I like to write about when I'm writing about superheroes is the sort of incompleteness of physical power as a means to solve problems.
Sure.
And the Wonder Twins, I think, were a great sort of analog to that. So yeah, I'm thrilled I get to write 6 more issues of Wonder Twins.
Fantastic. We're looking forward to that.
Thanks. Hope I don't screw them up.
And obviously the most recent thing that you're working on is Second Coming.
Yeah.
Which originally was supposed to be DC, but then moved to Ahoy.
We're with Ahoy now. And being with a smaller, more sort of boutique publisher has allowed us to do a lot more. So it was really, I think, best for everyone. We were able to make the first issue 30 pages long, and it's so much different being with those 8 extra pages than it would have been otherwise. And it allows us to bring in Leonard Kirk to help Richard Pace. This is actually Richard Pace's idea, and I give him total credit for it. But he wanted the heaven scenes to look very different than the earth scenes, and so it was his idea to bring a finisher to sort of change up the artwork, depending upon where the story was taking place, and it just worked out brilliantly.
Fantastic. So, what can you tell us about Second Coming for those of you who haven't heard about it?
The short version is that it's a story about Jesus Christ sharing a 2-bedroom apartment with a superhero. But the slightly longer version is that it's about a superhero realizing that their powers are useless against their everyday problems, and a deity coming back to Earth to realize that everyone has sort of ignored his teachings. I write a lot about futility
Yeah.
That's really where all conflict sort of
I think,
stems
to be
from.
honest, we can all relate to that.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah,
we all lose more than we win.
well, that's true. Yeah.
So I think we relate to futility, and I think that's the source of conflict. It's like Schopenhauer once said that the life is divided between frustration and boredom. It's like you either are frustrated because you can't get what you want, or you get it and then you're bored.
Yeah.
And I always find the frustration more interesting.
Well, I think that's the best way to end that there. So many thanks, Mark, and
Thank
look forward to doing the rest of Second Coming and the next lot of Wonder Twins. Anything else you have in the pipeline you'd like to talk about? Anything you can talk about?
Speaking of Count Chocula, I'm going to have some more of those breakfast cereal monster stories coming out on Ahoy's. Their title, Edgar Allan Poe's Snifter of Terror.
Oh, fantastic.
So
yeah,
they're
that's a
turning
great
them into
title,
like
yeah.
short little comic vignettes.
Okay.
So check that title out, Edgar Allan Poe's Snifter of Terror, and you can catch my Count Chocula fan fiction there.
Super.
Although for legal reasons, he will be the Marquis de Coco.
Of course. Yes. He always has been. Many thanks, Mark. Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much. Cheers.
Thanks, Peter.
Supergirl doesn't realize it, but the first 2 attempts were bait, and she's bitten. The real assassin will be inside the White House. Supergirl herself. Ready, Hepzibah?
Aye, replies the white-haired figure, and the mustachioed... I was trying not to laugh at you.